Alright, let's do one more example. Now once again, we're going to try to do this in two steps. Step one is we're going to try to predict what our graph is going to look like before we actually get into it. Then we're going to graph it. So again, your work on this assignment, whether it's today or the next day, is going to look like this. First thing I want to see is for you to use A to predict what the graph will look like. Now in this case, A is 1, which means actually 1 is that cutoff point. It's going to basically be our parent graph. So it's going to be just kind of an average looking parabola, not too wide, not too narrow. It's going to look a lot like that graph we kept doing in the lab. And then it's a positive one, which means it's going to be a U shape, right side up. So right away we get some information of what we know what that's going to look like. Now, the next thing we look at is B, but as we've discussed before, B is a little tricky because B shifts the graph left and right, but it also depends on what A is. So we have a formula for that. The axis of symmetry at X is equal to negative B over 2A, and in this case negative B, which is 4, over 2 times A, which is 1, which gives us an axis of symmetry at negative 2. Which means on my graph I can put a dotted line at X as negative 2, so I can see that my graph is going to be centered a little bit over to the left. Finally, we'll look at C. And C is the y-intercept, which is 3, so it tells me on the y-axis my graph is going to cross at 3. So before we even get started on the actual graphing, we've got a lot of information about our graph. It's going to look a lot like the parent graph we kept graphing on the math lab. It's going to be a right side up U shape. It's going to have an axis of symmetry centered over to the left at negative 2 and a y-intercept of 3. So now we can actually get to the graph. Now once again, for the graph we're looking for 5 points. And so we basically go old school graphing and make an XY coordinate table. And we can list our first point here of 3, so that'd be when X is 0, Y is 3. Now let's start picking some other points centered around our axis of symmetry. So let's try, in this case, negative 1. If I plug in negative 1 squared is positive 1. 4 times negative 1 is negative 4 plus 3. So 1 minus 4 is negative 3 plus 3 is 0, and so at negative 1, 0, there's another point. Now let's do the axis of symmetry itself, because it always gives us that high point or low point on our parabola, which by the way is called the vertex. You'll start to hear that vocabulary quite a bit. But let's do negative 2. Negative 2 squared is 4. 4 times negative 2 is negative 8 or minus 8 plus 3. And then 4 minus 8 is negative 4 plus 3 is negative 1. Once again, you should be showing this work down here because it will help us from making mistakes later, or if we do make a mistake we can go back and check it. So negative 2, 1 would be right here. And now even though I need 5 points, I don't necessarily have to keep going here, but I can use the points over here and the fact that this is the axis of symmetry. It creates a mirror image on the opposite side, and I can reflect these points across that line. So for this point here, there's a mirror image point over here. For this one here, there's a mirror image point right here. Now this is kind of small, so I think I'm going to do one more. I'm going to do X is 1. 1 squared is 1. 4 times 1 is 4, plus 3, and all that added up is 8, so 1, 8 would be right here, and its mirror image point would be right here. So now I can see the parabola a little more clearly, and I can graph it. Okay, so this is what the work should look like when you do this assignment. First, predict these 3 things. Predict what A is going to tell you about the graph, find the axis of symmetry, find the y-intercept. Then, once you have that information, you've got a general idea of what you're looking for. You're then going to do an XY table, plug in points until you get at least 5 or more.